Alright, so now let's have a look at the temporal and infratemporal regions. These are actually called the temporal and infratemporal fossae, the plural of fossa. And these are interesting regions, but there are some interesting muscles and arteries that are especially in the infratemporal fossa. Okay, so in the temporal region, you can see there are these two lines. One of them is called the superior, which serves as an attachment site for the temporal fascia, for the muscle of the same name, and the inferior temporal line for muscle as well. Okay, we can also see that there are several bones that contribute to the formation of the temporal region. Specifically, that will be the four bones that contribute to the formation of the terion, which is this region right here. See, it looks a little bit like an H, and there are four bones that contribute to it, namely your frontal bone, your parietal bone, your temporal bone, and your sphenoid bone. The inferior boundary of the temporal fossa is going to be the infratemporal crest, which is below here. The anterior boundary is going to be parts of the frontal bone and the zygomatic arch, or the zygomatic bone. The lateral boundary is actually the zygomatic arch, which you can see here. And the zygomatic arch is made up of both a part of the zygomatic bone, but also part of this bone here, your temporal bone. The roof will have been formed by fascia, specifically by temporalis fascia. Now we can see some of it. Now we don't. And we've already discussed the floor. The infratemporal fossa is actually a space that is going to be below the temporal fossa and deep to the mandible, specifically actually deep to the ramus of the mandible, which is this part here. It is posterior to the maxilla. If I turn this and rotate the head a little bit, we can dive into here, and now we can see that the infratemporal fossa is going to be posterior to the maxilla and inferior to the temporal fossa. The boundaries of the infratemporal fossa are going to be laterally the ramus of your mandible. So why don't we just go ahead and hide the mandible now. There we go. I'm going to rotate back into our regular view. The posterior boundary is going to be your styloid process, your mastoid process, and the tympanic plate. Medially, this bone here, which is the lateral pterygoid plate, is going to be your boundary, and superiorly, the infratemporal crest of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. There are several communications of the infratemporal fossa with the surrounding areas. So now I've turned off all the colors, and we can see what happens if I also cut out the zygomatic arch. So we can see a couple of features that will enable the infratemporal fossa to communicate with the surroundings. We have the pterygomaxillary fissure, which is approximately here. That is a communication between the infratemporal fossa, laterally, and the pterygopalatine fossa, which is going to be medial or deep to this here. Okay. There's also an opening here called the sphenopalatine foramen. That's an opening in the medial wall of the pterygopalatine fossa that will then enter the nasal cavity medially. So we can actually see from here there's a communication between the nasal cavity and the infratemporal fossa. We have the inferior orbital fissure. If I change the orientation a little bit, here's the inferior orbital fissure. That is between the greater wing of your sphenoid and the maxilla. The infratemporal surface of your maxilla is also an important boundary here. And the lateral plate of the pterygoid process, which is this one here, part of the sphenoid bone, is a fairly apparent landmark. There's another feature which is not going to be visible very clearly here, but it is important for us to understand that it exists in lab. There's an opening called the petrotympanic fissure that actually goes to the tympanic cavity, but there's a little nerve that'll be exiting out of that fissure called the chorda tympani. We will learn some more about that later on, which is very important because it joins another nerve, namely the lingual nerve, and conveys, for instance, special sensory fibers such as taste, or also parasympathetics that are headed towards the submandibular ganglion. zygomatic arch.